Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at such short notice. I'm David Rayfield. I am the co-founder and executive director of the Jewish Grandparents Network. The war in Ukraine is an urgent topic that impacts us all. As citizens of the world, we are horrified at the reports of violence and the horrifying images of the war. As grandparents and parents, we know that in this highly interconnected world, our children and grandchildren are being exposed to the frightening face of war as never before. Finally, Ukraine has played a significant role in the history and culture of the Jewish people. I would wager that if we took a poll, more than half of the participants joining us this evening have at least one relative whose family emigrated from the Ukraine, as my maternal grandmother did. This evening, we are fortunate to have two very special presenters, each of whom is a highly respected leader and authority in their field. Additionally, both are significant mentors. Dr. Will Recant is the Assistant Executive Director of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and serves as the Director for all of JDC's non-sectarian and disaster relief programs. He and his team are coordinating the Jewish response to the war in Ukraine, including the joint highest Chabad and the Israeli government. In the first part of our presentation, Dr. Recant will share with us the arc of Jewish history in Ukraine, the current situation on the ground, including the international Jewish response, and how we too might help. Dr. Lisa Miller is the New York Times bestselling author of The Spiritual Child and The Awakened Brain and is professor in the clinical psychology program at Teachers College at Columbia University. She is the founder director of the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute and has held over a decade of joint appointments in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University Medical School. In the second half of the program, Dr. Miller will give us insights about how to talk to our children and grandchildren about this situation. We plan on ending the program by 8 p.m. We will take your questions throughout. Please type them into the chat bar. My colleague Terry Kay will share your questions with our presenters. Additionally, throughout the program, we will post websites where you could support relief efforts in Ukraine in the Ukrainians caught in this terrible conflict. Finally, I'd like to thank the Joint Distribution Committee for co-sponsoring this evening's event. Of far greater importance, let us all recognize the JDC for the breadth of the remarkable efforts on behalf of Jewish communities around the world. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Will Recant.
Thank you, David. I'll first talk a little bit about the Jewish history in Ukraine when Jews first arrived, the background leading up to today. So the first settlers were in the Black Sea region around the year 500. But recorded history shows Jewish communities in the Crimea area in about the year 1000, and that Jewish communities were prevalent through trading throughout parts of Ukraine at that period. They were treated well, they were not mistreated, but throughout the history, it's impossible to conflate the difference between the Jewish history of Poland, the Jewish history of Ukraine, Lithuania, the Austro-Hungary Empire, because it all came together at different periods in time. And the reality is, with the expulsion from Spain, Jews were welcomed into Poland. The Polish regime, the Polish kings welcomed Jewish refugees, and Jewish life thrived in what was then considered Poland. What was then Poland included Lithuania, Belarus, and what is today Ukraine. There were divisions of the kingdom. Russia came in, and when Catherine the Great came in and half of Poland was annexed, a large part of Jews became Russian Jews. That's when the Pale of Settlement was created. We all heard about it. It's where Jews were forced to live. They weren't allowed to live. Moscow businessmen did not want to compete with Jewish businessmen who were coming into Moscow. And they convinced Catherine the Great to get rid of them and form a Jewish territory, which became the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement was a vast land area going from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, encompassing what became 82% of the Jewish world in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. Hasidism started in Ukraine. The Baal Shem Tov was from Ukraine. It was the birthplace of Hasidim. It was the birthplace of Jewish intellectualism and Jewish mysticism and Jewish spirituality. And this comes after years of revolts, of anti-Semitic activities. In the mid-1600s. There was the Chelmnitsky revolt, which included Cossacks and killed as many as 100,000 Jews that were living in that region. 300 Jewish communities were wiped out during that revolt in the mid-1600s. About 100 years later, Hasidism comes in, and Hasidism dominated that part of what is now Ukraine. And there are great, there are great rabbis, in speaking with David earlier, he mentioned the Bratislava Rebbe, who was from Ukraine. Rabbi Schneerson, the head of Chabad, who came before the Holocaust, was from Ukraine. Golda Meir from Ukraine. A lot of, Yiddish theater, Sholem Aleichem, Fiddler on the Roof. When we think of the shtetl, we see Fiddler on the Roof. That was Ukraine, but that was 82% of Jewish life throughout the 1800s. Pogroms in the late 1800s, in 1881 and on, forced many Jews to leave. That's why many Jews left, including many of our forefathers and foremothers coming from that part of the world to the United States and elsewhere. And there was a tremendous diaspora from the Pale of Settlement. The Soviet Union comes in 1917, takes over the area. There were tremendous anti-Semitic activities that took place. There was hunger and starvation in Ukraine. Over 500,000 Ukrainians starved from 1917 to 1922. And the Joint Distribution Committee actually ran a large program called Agro Joint from 1921 to 1932, working with Jewish communities throughout Ukraine, teaching them how to farm the land and live off the land, because most of them had no idea how to work with agriculture. We've heard about Babi Yar, the atrocities that took place by the Germans, by the Nazis when they came into Ukraine. Babi Yar, the large ravine that is now called Babin Yar. And there was the famous poet Yevtushenko from the former Soviet Union in 1962, who wrote his poet that said, there is no memorial at Babi Yar. And that was the opening for Soviet Jewry to say what had taken place during the Holocaust. Ukraine was the homeland, it's the heartland of the former Soviet Union. It's the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union. Ukrainians were known to be viciously anti-Semitic during the Holocaust. Ivan the Terrible, there were other Ukrainian guards. And I've often been asked about anti-Semitism in Ukraine today and what's left. And there is nothing left on the governmental level, on the political level. There's education in the Ukrainian schools as to what anti-Semitism was and what had taken place. And when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the JDC had access to the Jewish community of Ukraine. And although many emigrated and made aliyah to Israel, there were still over 500,000 Jews that remained in Ukraine. What do you do after 70 years of communism, Nazism, a community that that was forbidden for practicing their religion? In 1991, it opened up. We sent in Jewish libraries, we sent in Jewish books, and the community responded by soaking it up and wanting more and more. And from the 90s and early 2000s, there have been programs throughout Ukraine. The Joint set up a program called the Chesed system, which is welfare societies, and similar to JCCs when the Soviet Union first broke out. There are over 1,000 locations throughout the Ukraine where we're working with Jewish communities. Today, working with 37,000 elderly Jews throughout the Ukraine, working with 2,500 in a program that started just 6 years ago called Active Jewish Teens, which are Jewish teens in a place where they didn't want to know, many of their grandparents, if they had one Jewish grandparent, they didn't want their child to know that they were Jewish. Why? Because during Soviet times, you had a Y, Evreysky, stamped on your passport. And anytime you traveled, they knew you were a Jew. So many grandparents didn't want the Y stamped in their grandchildren's passports. And they didn't know they were Jews for many years. So educating the community at first was a tremendous task. But in recent years, they've imbibed it, they love it. And there are 2,500 Jewish teens who work with elderly and volunteer to do the myriad of programs that our teens do, but that was alien to Ukrainian culture. Volunteerism is not something native and normal to the Ukrainian people or former Soviet cultures, but the Jewish teens in Ukraine adopted it, and they were thriving. And during COVID, they were going to the elderly's home and delivering supplies when people couldn't get out of their homes. There's a volunteer network of 3,400 assisting 13,000 elderly Ukrainian Jews. This is just within the Jewish community. The JDC to this day maintains 4 field offices in Dnepropetrovsk, Odessa, Kyiv, and Kharkov. There are 18 Chesed centers that remain active. These are community centers that affect Jews in over 1,000 locations in Ukraine. So when you come to today and you ask about what this invasion has meant to the Jewish community of Ukraine, it's meant that they are devastated. And if you remember nothing else, remember that Jewish communities, wherever they are in the world, are a product of the overall social, political, and economic situation in which they live. We mostly have the privilege of being in North America and living the same way that our North American compatriots live. I've had the privilege of working for the Joint for more than 30 years and visiting many of the 70 countries in which we work. The Jews of Ukraine are in the midst of a war zone. We tried to prepare them in advance. We took extra steps in advance, preparing the Chesed centers with extra food and medicine, preparing in case the worst would come, shelters, phone hotlines so that every member of the community is linked, not just by the phone, not just by the internet, but there are addresses that people can go to. But when people leave their homes and are in shelters and leave and go elsewhere, it's impossible to keep track of everyone and everything. So in just reading to you the latest things that the Joint is doing during the emergency. One is identifying and securing safe facilities for internally displaced persons. Two is transport both from cities within Ukraine to get people to the border areas, and then transport from the border areas to inner towns throughout Poland, Romania, Moldova, wherever other local Jewish communities are hosting Jewish refugees. Providing food and medicines to those who cannot make it to shelters and not make it to camps, meaning individuals who need food and medicine delivered to their apartments because they're elderly and they're homebound and they can't get out. Cash assistance was given in advance. Cash assistance started to be given about a month ago to those in greatest need. Cash assistance to the new poor. And out of a community of about 40,000, of about 200,000 in Ukraine, you can imagine how many new poor there are. Hotlines to Israel, hotlines to Moldova, hotlines to Poland, hotlines to Romania, where anyone and everyone, we're reaching out from Israel to elderly in Ukraine as it's being bombarded, to bring them psychological hotlines and work with and have therapists sitting on the other line, working with their survivors in Ukraine who are being shelled for the second time in their lives. We're supporting wartime community organizations, Jewish organizations within Ukraine, and other Jewish organizations like the JCC in Krakow that is now stepping up to the plate and hosting refugees and taking and sheltering others. And an SOS fund for extraordinary individual cases, which are coming out regularly. The situation is desperate. The Jewish world is responding. From Israel, the Israeli government is speaking regularly with President Zelensky, is sending in humanitarian assistance. There are a number of Israeli NGOs, including Israel and Natan and Magen David Adom and United Hatzalah, that are already everywhere on the border areas. Chabad, who I have spoken to Rabbi Eliezri, who's in charge of Global Jewish Relief and Assistance Network, which is the Chabad Relief and Assistance Network for non-sectarian assistance, as well as assisting Jews, is well coordinated. About 25 years ago, we set up something called the Jewish Coalition for Disaster Relief to make sure that all Jewish organizations are coordinated and that there's no duplication of effort and that there's no money that's going to projects that we don't think they should be. So you should know that the entire Jewish world is coordinated as to what its response is. And whether you donate to HIAS because you're interested in humanitarian refugee relief, or you donate to Israel, which is working on the border in Moldova with refugees, or you donate to the Joint, which is working all over with Jews and non-Jews. So you should know that in addition to the work that we do, which is rescue, relief of Jewish communities, we also have a very large humanitarian, non-sectarian program in which we work with all denominations and have done everything from building mosques in Kosovo to working with, the Turkish Red Crescent in Turkey during times of disaster. So
may I jump in? We have a couple of questions. Thank you so much. It's very informative. We have a couple of questions asking if you anticipate refugees will come to the US. Will they mostly stay in Europe? And somebody else asked, will they be going to Israel? Will Israel accept sort of mass groups of refugees?
Israel is accepting Jews, and the Jewish Agency for Israel has already brought about 3,000 Jews from Ukraine and is prepared to bring 10,000 within the immediate months. Israel is not accepting other refugees, and there has not been talk about other refugees moving beyond the neighboring areas immediately. But we all know that that is coming. And I have spoken with Hayas, who is involved with resettling Afghani refugees right now, but they are preparing for large numbers of Ukrainian refugees to move all over. First, it's expected that they're going to move throughout the EU because they're going to be in EU countries and be able to cross borders. But very quickly, the UNHCR is predicting that it's going to be a global refugee movement.
Thank you. We have a hello from your cousin Judy. She expresses deep thanks to the joint. Another question is, you gave several examples of life, of the chesed and community life in Ukraine, amongst the Jews. Do you have perhaps other examples of Jewish religious life prior to this event?
So Jewish religious life took off in Ukraine starting in about 1996. I remember I was in Kiev with a colleague from the Joint, and there was a Reconstructionist rabbi who opened up just a little shul in her home. And this was early in the 90s, shortly after things had reopened. And on one Friday night, there were more than 400 people just flocking and standing outside on her lawn and just listening to the tunes. So there's been a complete revival of Jewish life. Chabad has been very active in many regions. The Joint has been setting up programs. First it started as holiday programs, and then it became, intergenerational programs that the community has openly accepted.
Thank you.
And so I'd just like to end with one last story before I turn it over to Lisa. And this is, a grandparent's story of a call that the Joint in Israel received through its hotline on Tuesday of this past week. And it was a Jewish grandmother calling to say that her 17-year-old grandson, who was originally from Ukraine, was in Ukraine visiting family that was there when the war broke out, and that she was really worried because they couldn't contact him and he had no way out. The last thing she knew was he was going to the train platform in Lvov, and that he was trying to get to either Romania or Moldova. And somehow she said she couldn't contact anyone, but she got a hold of someone at the JDC in Israel who said to her, I happen to be on the line with a colleague in Ukraine, so why don't you send me his picture and I'll send it to my colleague in Ukraine. And it just happened that there was somebody both in Lvov and in Kiev at the train station, and they looked at the picture, and because no men over the age of 18 are allowed to leave, they saw this 17-year-old guy standing there, looked at the picture, saw him, got him out, got him to Moldova, and then to Romania, where his grandmother flew from Israel to meet him and then escort him back home. So grandparents of Ukrainian children are facing a very, very difficult psychological and traumatic time right now. And, you know, there but for the grace of God walk you or I. So thank you, and I will turn it over to Lisa.
Dr. Will, thank you for that moving story. There is no love in the world like the love of a grandparent, and that story shows that in spades. And you mobilize a grandparent and you can find your grandson. It's extraordinary. And thank you for the broad reach and the foresight and acuity with which you planned ahead. I mean, way ahead, hotlines and shelters, and it's extraordinary the reach of your impact. So we all thank you. And David and Terry, thank you for including me today. It's a joy to be back with the grandparents. I feel part of your community. And of course, my parents are Jewish grandparents, and they are here tonight, Margot and Sid Friedman. I'm so grateful they joined us. And I'm here to share with you ways that grandparents might look into this moment as a way of connecting and supporting and guiding your grandchildren. We've talked in the past when we talked about the spiritual child and we talked about the awakened brain, that even very, very difficult times are actually an opportunity for a deepening of the bond between a grandparent and a child, and that very, very difficult times are a time to build a spiritual response to trauma, a spiritual response to fear and upset. So it's within that frame that I'm going to share with you some thoughts about this current moment now. And I thank again, David and Terry, for this opportunity to bring the science into really a roadmap for the moment. The first is, before we even get into the transmission of spiritual life and a spiritual coping style, simply to establish, as you know already, having raised children to become grandparents, to establish safety, and particularly with a very young child, simply saying that, you know, this is very upsetting and hard for the Ukrainian children and parents and grandparents, but you are safe. You know, are land and sea and land a very, very far distance away. So we are very grateful, and we are very grateful as a family to be able to say that here we are safe. Then, having established that, and in our hearts, we have so much feeling for our sisters and brothers in Ukraine. In our hearts, we have so much feeling for the other girls and boys, the mothers and fathers, the grandfathers and grandmothers in Ukraine, some of whom are family of family. We have such feeling for fellow Jews, and we have feelings for all people, Jews and non-Jews alike. And what are ways then to think about that opportunity, the opportunity of how a young child bombarded by images, bombarded by the internet, bombarded by the television, bombarded by the voices at school, very, very most likely heard of this in a way that wasn't sculpted or curated by parents. And if they didn't, they likely will. So how can you get ahead in that case of the very strong likelihood that they will be bombarded by messages? This is whether you say a time of evil and destruction or a time of disturbance, whether you use a mental health model or a good and evil model, it is a time of enormous upset. How, as grandparents, can this be understood in the eyes of a child? A child might use words and say, how is it that God allows this to happen? How is it that if God created people, they could be so cruel or evil to one another? Particularly a teen or a middle school student. You know, if God is so good, why does he or she allow this to happen? And these are questions of spiritual coming of age. These are hardwired spiritual individuation questions happening in the context of very salient destruction. So what can we say to that? And here's where I think I've learned from many of my colleagues some very, very, very beautiful responses. I'm going to start with a response that was that of Rabbi Shaul Praver following the Newtown Sandy Hook massacre. On the 1-year anniversary, Shaul Praver stood at the bima and he invited the children up. And these children were 6 and 7. They'd been in the school the day their friends were murdered. He invited them up and he said, I want you to lead our ceremony today with me. And drawing on the wisdom of the child and the openness of the child, and the child is a knower, he said, if we here in Sandy Hook had found through petri dishes and lab test tubes, right here, a lab, a cure for cancer, would that be a local event or would that be an event of great national world significance? And the children said, well, the whole world, of course. And then Rabbi Praver said, well, here we have seen great destruction. And so what might be our cure that we share with the world here in Newtown? I invite each child to take your hands, touch your heart, and pull forward love and make a ball of love. The children did that. They made love balls. He said, and now I'd like you to make your ball bigger and add more and more love until it's so big, it's just fitting your hand that you might cock it back and hurl that big ball of love at your enemy. A spiritual response to destruction, a spiritual response to rage or evil or disturbance can be love. It doesn't mean you love what they did. It's can you meet destruction with love? That we might be transmuted, that love might be a form of transformation for those living with an angry heart. And similarly, just this week, I met with Dr. Q English. She is head of the Department of Health and Human Services, faith-based office. And I said, Dr. English, Jewish grandparents are so extraordinary. Listen to this. I can't wait. This Sunday, I'm going to be speaking to the Jewish Grandparents Network. And the first thing she said was, well, please tell those grandparents how very wise they are, that they are thinking ahead of how they might speak to their grandchildren. And then the second thing she said is, here's what I would do. And she said, for those of you who pray, pray that God might touch the heart of those who commit suffering and pain. For those, even Vladimir Putin, who orchestrates destruction, might God touch his heart with love. And as you pray that God might touch those perpetrating harm with love, can we pray that those who are suffering be given protection, be given sustenance, feel God's presence? And as you pray for those on all sides of this moment, pray too, how might you respond through action? And here, this is a very Jewish concept, that how, as we pray to God, just as Tikkun Olam, transcendently, please step in and help us. How might we, with our own hands and hearts, be inspired in that prayer to act, whether it is through making a card that I am with you for the Jewish children through Will's joint arterial network. I am with you. We are thinking of you. We stand by you. Is it by raising money and sending resources or mittens and hats? Or is it by being a voice? As the president of Ukraine said, please, Jews, use your voice, speak out. How is the child as a knower inspired to step forward for both Jews and non-Jews who are suffering? In this moment, you as a grandparent are saying there is and has been since time destruction, whether you call it evil or disturbance, in your own words, your own natural, authentic words. But we can bring a spiritual response, a Jewish value, a spiritual response to suffering through prayer, through transcendence, and through interpersonal action. Now, Terry asked a very, very interesting question of how our history as Jews speaks to this moment, and how, as grandparents, we might narrate and transmit deep Jewish values and held in our history into this moment, bring to life the lineage of our Jewish values. And what was absolutely blaringly magnificent in this moment, I thought, above all else, was that the president of Ukraine was offered limitless money and safety for himself and his family were he to leave. Right? And he said, I don't want to ride. We need ammunition. The choice to stay and fight for liberty, to not leave his people, is to be a Maccabee. He is a Maccabee. He is someone who fights for liberty. And as we see waves of refugees, as Will pointed out, as we see waves of people with no home, we can hearken to our own history of being strangers in a strange land. And as we show up for the stranger, because you were strangers once too in a strange land, we can know that as Jews and non-Jews alike, we are exercising Jewish values, that we reach out to those who are dislocated, that we create a home for those who are dislocated. I think that perhaps one of the most remarkable moments in my life as a child was asking my parents as I watched the Vietnam troops return home. Why are we there? My mother was crying in front of TV, looking at 14-year-old Vietnamese boys with guns, saying, why on both sides of this conflict are boys pushed into this situation? And the notion that the Ukrainians are souls on earth and the Russians are souls on earth, and none of them chose this war. None of them chose this war. This was made by leaders, not by fighters. And the people didn't choose this war. So war, as we look at this, it's hard even to believe the images. It seems so obsolete. The other day, they were all dating each other. They were all together. They were friends. It seems so far from the one world, the global community in which we live.
Lisa, is now a good time to jump in with a question
Sure,
from one of our participants?
Go ahead.
Somebody would like to know if our kids have been through so much and they're sort of just coming out of COVID, and tomorrow they get to take off their masks at least in New York and New Jersey. And they may or may not. But anyway, the point is the kids have been through trauma, and you addressed it when you previously presented for JGN. Is this experience different for the children? How are will they react in a similar fashion or in some different way?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested. Do you think this is scarier or less scarier? Or is it just one that builds on the other in terms of our children's fears?
So generally speaking, what research shows is that trauma is cumulative. So one trauma versus two traumas versus three or more traumas has increasing levels. It's really, it accelerates of anxiety and fear. It's easier to get more afraid facing the third trauma in a row. So this is something that more than ever might require a spiritual response to trauma. If we look at post-traumatic growth, if we look at the data on how is it in times where the world as I knew it doesn't hold. The trauma is not just anxiety and fear. Trauma is a sense that the world as I trusted it, the world as I felt held, isn't, the ground is shaking under my feet. That actually is a time for a grandparent or a parent to step in and help that child develop what many people call post-traumatic growth or post-traumatic spiritual growth, which can become a stance, a way of coping with difficulty, so that the next trauma, instead of being more rattling, actually that child is better girded to absorb. So this is a moment of not just engagement, but it's also a moment of building resilience for the next trauma. We live in a world that seems to be right now full of mounting traumas. And it's, in that sense, never been more important to get in there and develop a stance. Now, what we know from Tedeschi and colleagues is that if you look at the 4 predictors of post-traumatic growth, it is being able to acknowledge the trauma, put it into words, share it in a group, and then shine the light of religious or spiritual practice on that experience. So if you are someone who prays, loving God, what do you show us here now? What can we be and do in this moment here? What will you have for us? Please hold us and guide us. Whatever your authentic prayer is, whatever your own deep, authentic spiritual sense of moving through trauma is, say it out loud. Say it and pray. If you are someone who prays by the side of your grandchild, let them see how you handle this moment in your deepest, wisest part of yourself. That they will listen and watch with eagle's eyes and never, ever forget how you brought them in to your spiritual way of holding this moment. And we are built for this. If you look through MRI studies, if you look at coping, there are circuits in our brain, spiritual circuits. I call it the awakened brain. When in my book, The Awakened Brain, there are circuits that help us see that we indeed are loved and held, that when we can't carry it alone, we have to hand it over. We are built to hand it over. Circuits for the bonding network. We are loved and held. Circuits of helping us find guidance to look not just top down, how am I going to deal with this? What I planned isn't working, but bottom up. What life, what God, what are you showing me now? And when we open our eyes to that natural, more spiritual way of looking at difficulty, the child by our side is hardwired to do the same. So what would I say to grandparents? If you are someone who prays, pray by your child's side. If you are someone who serves, serve by your child's side. If you are preparing a box with food, if you are preparing a box with mittens, if you are preparing blankets, if you're sending money, do it by your child's side. And they will have that response when the earth shakes under their feet the rest of their lives. This is actually one of the deepest, finest gifts you can give them.
So I just want to reiterate that for 1 minute. It sounds like what we do is perhaps far more important than what we say, or how we do in their presence is of great importance. So whether that's praying, giving to charity, whatever it is, to do that in their presence to demonstrate that we're not powerless in either you.
And that, yes, and that we can respond with good and love in moments of great destruction and darkness, that this doesn't swallow us up. Part of the anxiety and trauma is that there's a felt sense that this entropy, this black hole, this undoing is going to suck me up. There's a sense of destruction, and that we actually hold a source. We can connect to God, we can connect to our source and live out in a positive way, even when there's darkness around us. Be a light in darkness.
Dr. Miller, was there anything you were going to continue with? Because we have a question, you'll let me, if you would, let us know when you've wrapped up.
Go ahead, go ahead.
No, well, this was a question for Dr. Recant.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it was, may I jump back to you, Dr. Recant? It was a question, there he is, that a participant would like to know is, are Jewish women making all family decisions alone since the husbands are in the army? Do many have to stay as caretakers of the elderly and disabled?
No. Jewish women with family are mostly leaving. Those who are staying behind are mostly not those with young families. And I think Jewish women are making the decisions as they always have, whether the husband is there or not. The Jewish women that I have met and worked with in Ukraine are empowered women, are modern women, are women who are in the front seat and are equal partners.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Miller.
Interesting question. Can I grab a question out of, which is, I see a grandparent here asking about how to navigate these times, and something that I think is very rich and powerful in forming the strength and the spiritual core of the child and the child's enduring capacity to deal with upending trauma is to share your story. Many of our grandparents have been through difficult times. There were grandparents who at times didn't have enough food to eat. There were grandparents who themselves were refugees. There were grandparents who've seen the world at war. And if you can share your story when you were their age, or when you were perhaps a little younger or older and faced what was in your time, trauma. We've all faced in every generation trauma. How did you move through it as a family? What did your father or mother say to you? And how did you move through to find a brighter time? Oftentimes, young people, when they're surrounded by difficulty, don't have that future sense that things will lift, that this too will pass, that there will be another moment. And your experience of living through decades of difficulty and then brightness and challenge and elevation, show them that there's times that are painful and times where we reemerge, but that they can always be the light in the darkness, no matter what they're surrounded by. Your story will be riveting. Your story, told of your own struggle and your own times of trauma, will be their roadmap to the other side. Okay, Terry, I just want to make sure stories got in there.
I actually want to have a follow-up question to that. We talked about our own family stories and our stories, and how does that extend beyond, let's say, the stories of the Jewish people as we enter into Purim, as we begin to approach Pesach and others? So I'd imagine that sharing our shared collective stories is part of that as well.
What a wonderful discussion to genuinely and deeply share around Passover. I mean, there's no question that we have been through plagues. There's absolutely no question. I mean, and this is a time for a renewal of a spiritual renaissance, really, in the family and in society. This is a time to see how really different was this past 3 years from times of plagues. So I think, you're saying something very important, David, which is we are actually not speaking only back to history. We are part of a lineage. And what was some of the resolution that we can learn from thousands of years ago?
So we've had a couple of people asking, referring to when you said you can tell the children they're safe, it's far away, it's happening across the ocean, and then more land. But how do we actually address, for example, anti-Semitism that high school and college students face? This is one question to do with that. And the other one is, how does showing our grandchildren our concern and selflessness in response to tragic events in other parts of the world resolve the fear and anxiety they're feeling about threats to themselves?
Could you repeat the second one?
So the second one is we saying, we demonstrate our selflessness and we give, as you see, we lead by example, say. How do you see that as resolving their fear about the threats to themselves? So the one person asked about the anti-Semitism, and I think this person's asking about young children. Is that enough, or could you expand on this?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I think that the anti-Semitism is deeply entrenched, right? And Will can say a lot about this around the world. There's plenty of people who are not anti-Semitic, and there's plenty of people who are. And I think that that's part of Jewish education, is learning how to live in the world where there's plenty of people who respect and love Jews and plenty of people who don't. I can think back to my childhood, and I faced plenty of anti-Semitism. I think it was part of learning to be a Jew in the world. And it's very important to talk about it. It's very important for grandparents to share their own stories, the goodness of people. And, I can think of times where people have gone way out of their way to show me their the extra mile, they're deep perspective Jews, and make sure that I was aware I was included. And then I can think of times where it was frank anti-Semitism. And we prepare our children for both, to love people and feel at home in the world, and to know that this is part of being a Jew in the world. And hopefully someday it won't be. We always say that, but it's been for a long time. So I was prepared for that. My parents did a good job with that, and my grandparents did a good job with that. And I think as grandparents, your stories of how you cope with that are strengthening and proactively arming the agency of your grandchildren, so that they will feel empowered to handle that when it comes around, and not surprised.
I'd like to ask Will or Dr. Recant a question. So you're kind of the go-to guy when it comes to things that we can do. Might you have a recommendation for a grandparent and a parent and their grandchild or child, and what they can do together? In other words, that would be both impactful and make a difference, yet, and at the same time, provide the same kind of emotional support that Dr. Miller is talking about.
I don't know what you can do in this specific case, but there was a time that we ran a program. It was for Syrian refugees, in which it was an interfaith effort with a medical group that was putting together hygiene kits for Syrian refugees and displaced persons. And it was so cool when we saw families coming together. And it was a family of grandparents, parents, children of all ages, standing on an assembly line, putting together hygiene kits that were then going to be boxed up and sent to Syria. And it was, there were Jews and there were Muslims and Christians. And, what I found personally is anytime that I've involved my kids, or my grandkids are too little to know if there's any effect, but it's been a real pleasant experience. And like you said before, just demonstrating by example. And I loved what Lisa said, because I got a lot standing at my father's side when he was praying. Not just in the rote prayer, but in the kavanah, in the intention with which he was praying. Especially, I remember during the 67 war, standing next to him and others in synagogue, and just feeling the wholeness of things. So just taking the kids and doing stuff with them.
Great.
David, just before you wrap up, I have one final question that came on my phone. The person I happen to know, my chat function is not working. Please ask about the do's and don'ts of having these conversations, vis-a-vis knowing what parents do and don't want their children to know and discuss. I think it's how to bring the parents into the mix.
Thank you for the question. Right. So there's a balance, right? There's a balance. I think sometimes parents say, we really don't want this talked about, and they express a strong boundary, and that may be the case. But as a grandparent, you always have the right to speak in your own first person of your own experience and your own stories. There's so much wisdom you have. And when you share your stories, whether it's your story of dealing with life as a young person during a war, whether it's your story of dealing with anti-Semitism, that is your story, and it's your gift to your grandchild. And the stories you choose to share can be profoundly replete with spiritual coping, with persistence, with belief in a better tomorrow, with being a light in the darkness, with service, even if the world's fraying around you. So your stories are your gift, and you choose when you share them. And as I think Will just put so beautifully, your prayers are your prayers. and an invitation for your grandchild to sit by your side or hold your hand or invite them into your prayer if they'd like to add anything. You know, when we've interviewed hundreds of adolescents who tell us about their experience of God. And what we hear so very often is my grandparents, they taught me to pray. And now when I think of God, it's kind of God and my grandparents all rolled into one. So you are an ambassador. You are a sacred ambassador. You are a torchbearer. And inviting your grandchild by your side, even over Zoom, is to bring them in to the very best thing you have. And that lasts forever.
Well, that's a wonderful way to wrap up. I want to thank Will Recant and Dr. Lisa Miller. Just a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I want to thank everybody who participated. And perhaps I'll end with a quote from one of my favorite Ukrainian Jews. It's Rav Nachman of Breslau, who says, "Seek the good in everyone and reveal it and bring it forth." Have a good evening, and everybody be safe, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Good night.
Thank you.